Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. We are your hosts, Austin Ritter, Dalton Shetler, with you. Our normal episode a day late because we wanted to get yesterday's episode in. If you are just joining us for the first time, you've stumbled upon our podcast. Thanks for joining us. Tell a friend. We appreciate you being here. We are available on Apple and Spotify podcasts. We also have a YouTube channel. We're a part of the Back Home Network. So head to the Back Home Network YouTube channel. You can watch us live there normally every Tuesday at noon Eastern time, where we have our live shows. You can jump in the chat, be a part of it. You can also watch our videos in post after that as well. Highly recommend going back and watching yesterday's episode, number 36, with Charlie Cream. Just fantastic. Dalton and I were joking we could have talked for hours and hours with Charlie, and I think he would have done it too. He loves women's basketball. Probably, I don't know if more, but we're certainly the three of us would go forever on this conference. So go back and listen or watch it. We have a lot of visual aids that I think were helpful. So if you want to go and watch it, there's some good visuals on there as well. But let's bring in my co-host, Dalton Shetler. Dalton, I just combined both of your names there. Daltler, how are you?
You know what? I've been called a lot worse than Daltler before, so I'm doing pretty good, Austin. How are you doing?
I'm great. You've got a bye week this week, so that means you're cozy at home, and we had back-to-back home games, so not having to do the show or the prep from the road, which is kind of nice. And as you know, when we get into February, we're very appreciative of any lengthy time we get to spend in our own house, in our own bed, broadcasting games from our own arenas. We're playing the little tiny violin, but like we are both thankful to be home. It allowed us to do 2 episodes this week, which is great. Give us a like, a subscribe, download our episodes. All that stuff really helps us. Without further ado, there's a lot to get to this week in the Big Ten. If you're watching us on YouTube, I'll flash the scores from the week at the bottom. But let's start, as we normally do, with our top 25. Nobody enters, nobody exits. Just a lot of, unfortunately, downward movement in the Big Ten top 25. It's kind of what Charlie was talking about in the last episode, that everybody just kind of beats each other, which is good for the Big Ten in terms of getting more teams into the field, but maybe not necessarily for some of these top teams. USC falls at the expense of Iowa. Maryland falls at the expense of Illinois. And to be honest, Maryland almost lost to Penn State. I think that was Wednesday. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday that they played that game and almost lost that one as well. So not a great stretch here for Maryland, which we will get into. They dropped to number 16. Michigan State loses at the expense of Oregon. They dropped 4 spots. USC down 3 spots. Ohio State hanging in there with that win over Washington. And we will get plenty into number 1 versus number 8, which is tonight. If you're listening to us or watching us here on this Wednesday reveal, that is tonight, Ohio State against UCLA. Anything there, Dalton? Illinois receiving the most votes of any unranked Big Ten team. I think that's fair after the 4-game win streak they're on. But what do you think about anything stand out to you about the top 25?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, and look, I mean, the AP Top 25, it matters, so we can talk about it and some other things. But
Yep.
ultimately, what matters the most are the metrics like the net ranking and how all of that shakes out. But with those recent results, Austin, I mean, with Michigan State tripping against Oregon, and then Oregon inexplicably being blown out by 32 at Michigan, like that's still a hard one to kind of digest. That one knocking Michigan State down those spots. Michigan State might have been in a spot where they could have been at this point in the season hosting tournament games. That was an important shift for them here in the AP Top 25, and they still have plenty of opportunities in front of them. That just was a noticeable thing, as it is for Maryland. I think Maryland maybe, according to what we had talked with Charlie Cream about, might be hovering around that potential hosting as well. So them tripping at home against Illinois is an interesting one. USC, not so noticeable because, as Charlie Cream says, he still has them on the 1 line. And so when you start to actually factor in through the framework of what this shapes out to look like for postseason, I think Michigan State and Maryland are the really interesting ones given this week's results.
Yeah, can the Big Ten get 4 or even 5 hosting schools in the NCAA tournament? I think is and Charlie talked about that too. We're going to reference that pod a lot. Go back and listen to it. But he mentioned that's where the drama is right now in the tournament. The bubble is a little weak, and a lot of the Big Ten teams are going to end up being on the right side of that bubble. The one line is not all that debatable right now, but the 4-5, the hosting school cutoff is where the drama is right now. And Michigan State and Maryland are both fighting for that. I'm going to try and share my screen here because I can show you the net rankings that we talked a ton about yesterday and see if we can share that here because this is what it looks like. Are you seeing my screen right now?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So if you're watching us on YouTube, just take a look at this list. You've got Maryland at 25, you've got Michigan at 27, Minnesota at 29, Iowa at 31, Illinois at 32, Oregon 36, Nebraska 37, Indiana 39. That is a ton of teams in this very small window of the net rankings. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 teams within 15 spots of the net rankings, which again is why Charlie Cream said most of the last, I think he said 6 of his last 11 teams in the field are Big Ten teams right now. So you mentioned the AP Top 25 is more for us as the media. The net rankings and to also keep in mind anything in the top 40, you're usually pretty good in terms of making the tournament. Minnesota's the one that Charlie Cream kind of presented they need to kind of get on their horse here and get some wins. But if you're inside the top 40, you're usually in a pretty comfy spot to make the tournament.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially, I mean, when you talk about 8 of these teams kind of being in that window, I mean, you're talking about just about half of the conference is affected in that window, where it's helpful for them to know. But 8 of them kind of hanging around there. We said altogether around 13 teams. Washington right now seems to be the team on the wrong side of the bubble in Charlie Cream's latest bracketology, but only by 1 spot. I mean, that's a carousel door. It's not shut. It is spinning around and around, and Washington can work itself right back on the other side of the bubble. And I think honestly that's going to be so much fun to watch as the final 7 to 8 games of the season play out and leagues kind of cannibalize themselves. Because as you mentioned, you talk about the drama that exists with the hosting. Charlie Cream had said that for Michigan State, they're maybe the first team on that 5 line right now. Ole Miss jumped back into that 4. The SEC, it's also pretty tough as well. And I think you could have the conversation 1A, 1B. You could lean one way or another. Maybe in terms of depth, you'd go with the Big Ten. Maybe in terms of top talent, maybe you land SEC. It kind of depends. But nonetheless, the SEC is going to be cannibalizing itself over the next few weeks as well. And so to see how the dust settles between those 2 leagues is going to be really interesting.
It's also important to note that I thought that was important that he said bracketology doesn't overreact to 1 loss or 1 win.
Yeah.
You and I will, and our power rankings are going to show that.
Yep.
And fans always do, but bracketology wise, it's not necessarily that drastic of a change. Before we get into things, I thought we could start today's show before we talk about all these individual games by putting our power rankings on the board. And then we can build off of that into the results of the week and explain ourselves as we talk about it. So without further ado, here are the February 5th Dribble Drive power rankings. We are the same through 4. Both of us moved Michigan State up. Despite the Oregon loss, they move up a spot.
I thought that's where we'd be different too. I thought maybe I'd protect Michigan State, but Austin, you had the same idea as me. I know we'll talk about it, but
to me, it's less about Michigan State and more about punishing Maryland for this stretch of games where they have underperformed. And it's even in the sloppy win at Penn State. It's the loss to Illinois. It's the loss to USC, and they just have the loss to Ohio State. They've struggled here. So to me, it was more of I got to drop Maryland down. And then we flipped 5 and 6. I was rewarding Illinois for the win at Maryland. Going there and winning that game was really impressive. So I moved Illinois up. 7 through 9 is a crapshoot.
Yep.
I took Nebraska out, which I think is a little harsh sitting here and thinking about it. But it was not a great week for Nebraska. And again, I am not a bracketologist. I flow with the wind. Okay. So the wind this week pushed Nebraska out. They really struggled at Mackey and then did not look good at Indiana. And those trips where you're gone for 4 or 5 days are tough.
Mhm.
But that just was not that impressed. And I wanted to reward Indiana and Iowa for their wins this week. Indiana beating Nebraska and Iowa getting the best win maybe anybody has in the conference right
Yep.
now. And I think my rationale for Iowa at 9, and then I'll let you go,
Mhm.
is that at their best, they are easily a top 9 team in this league.
Mhm.
And we saw their best on Sunday. Now, are they always going to show their best? No. They only beat Northwestern by 5 on their home floor earlier in the week. But I think I can see the upside of Iowa, and I'm starting to buy into it because you're seeing Jan Jansen make some changes. She's no longer starting the two bigs. Addison O'Grady is now coming off the bench. You're seeing Aaliyah Guyton get a lot more run. You're seeing her lean into these freshmen. And then for the first time in a while, we saw Lucy Olson take over a basketball game. And so I think just all the pieces together, I was like, it's hard to watch that game on Sunday and say that's not a top half team in the Big Ten. And I think it's recency bias. It's me watching Nebraska Sunday afternoon, coming home and watching Iowa on my TV and being like, I know Nebraska beat Iowa, but man, Iowa looks like a better team right now. So I went with Iowa. You're splitting hairs there. Michigan could be in there as well.
Mhm.
Um, I punished Michigan for the loss to Wisconsin. I just didn't think that. I know they pummeled Oregon. Michigan and Nebraska are kind of like T10 to me. Minnesota had a
Yeah.
tough week in LA. They're hanging in there, but you could put anybody from 7 through 9 of that like 6 team group. You could put any of them there, and I think would be fair. So you go ahead, explain your top 9.
Well, and I agree with a lot of it, and I do want to throw this out as a baseline for the listeners. The answers or rationales you can poke holes in. It is hypocritical. You're choosing to pick some guidelines or rules
Yes.
for one team and maybe not for the other, and ignoring some others. And honestly, it's just reflective of the results we've seen in previous weeks. The last few weeks, it has been all over the place. It's been hypocritical in terms of the results we've seen. But with that being said, let's go ahead and give it a whirl. I'm with you. I got Michigan State at 4 as well. The loss to Oregon was unfortunate. It was a missed opportunity for Michigan State. But it is a game where they shot 31%, 32% for the floor, still had a chance to win. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't be punished for a loss. But the point just is Oregon actually had a really good shooting day for the Ducks. Michigan State didn't show up to play coming out the gates. We're down 21-8 at the end of the first quarter. If we're grading body of work, I still think Michigan State is that good. They're okay. It just was a bad night, a bad start. And Deja Kelly's a 14% 3-point shooter, but she hit, I think, 2 threes in that game. And it was just that kind of day where Oregon was going to find some luck from outside. And Michigan State just didn't have answers for Philly Che and the size that the Ducks have inside. But then Maryland, I'm with you. I think at this point we do need to punish them some. I didn't drop them 2 spots like you did. I still want to see Brenda Freeze tinkering with this rotation and see what they can figure out. I mean, they're still playing with it enough where they started DeBerry last game. It was the second game of the season that she has started, the 6'6" forward who previously had started her career at UConn. They're trying to figure out life without Bree McDaniel, and they have Cheyenne Sellers back. Is she 100% or just kind of toughing things out? It's still kind of tough to really tell. But having her just even in uniform and goggles is a big difference for Maryland. But they're still working on that rotation, and I give them a little bit of grace while they're trying to figure that out because they're obviously still tinkering. Illinois right there too. Impressive win at Maryland. Earlier this week, though, they were in overtime with Rutgers. You give them credit for figuring it out, but it goes to show again the hypocrisy of these teams here in weeks. I mean, it takes extra time to survive against the Scarlet Knights, but they go on the road and win in College Park for their first ever win over the Terps. Like it was really impressive stuff. But that's kind of how I see the 1 through 6. And then I put Indiana one spot ahead of where you did, Austin. I think what we've seen from the Hoosiers in the win at Washington and the handling of Nebraska, I think you're starting to see things click a bit more on offense, and you could speak a little bit more to this. But Garzone obviously went 8 for 10 for 35 points, 8 for 10 from three on that trip to Washington. You saw him score 76 points against Nebraska's defense this last time out. I think they're starting to figure things out. And when we talked with Charlie Cream yesterday, he said sometimes it feels like for Indiana, it's as simple as are they going to make jump shots or not? But it feels like Yarden's gotten more in a rhythm and more comfortable with some of those looks. Feels like that offense as a whole is clicking at a different level. And with that kind of trajectory and momentum, I like them right now at 7. I didn't punish Nebraska as much as you did, but I do have concerns about Nebraska right now. I think the 60 points at Assembly Hall, I think uh, if they're not getting 15 to 20 from Markowski any given night, it makes life really tough on a freshman guard and Britt Prince and the rest of that perimeter. And it's concerning. So I do knock them down. I didn't knock them out. Oregon, I knocked down one. I mean, it's an impressive win at East Lansing, but it's such a head scratcher to read that final score from Ann Arbor. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And in Michigan being right there, kind of on the outside too with Minnesota. That's kind of how I went about stacking those up. But I mean, like I said, it's all pretty hypocritical.
Well, and it's like I do value head to head, and I try to
Yeah.
value it as much as I can. But then there's a
Yep.
point where it's like, yeah, Maryland beat Michigan State, but that was a while ago. That was a different Maryland team. And then, like, but then I get stuck in the okay, I'm going to keep Oregon above Indiana because they beat Indiana, but Oregon just lost by 32. So like I understand why you dropped them. So like it's so hard. I think at some point the head-to-heads are just going to be too hard to keep the integrity of, and you're
Yes.
just going to have to eye test this thing. Because there's also something about you're getting head-to-heads, but they're always going to be at somebody's facility
Mhm.
and somebody's always going to be the road team. So to me, like a head to head of Illinois winning on the road at Maryland is a lot more severe than Maryland winning on their home court against Michigan State.
Yeah.
Or eventually, I could see where you're at with Indiana, maybe jumping Oregon if the results continue and saying, look, Indiana lost on the road by 7 in a tight, low scoring game away from home against a good Oregon team. That shouldn't be just an automatic Oregon stays above them the entire year type of situation. Iowa at home, they lost to Nebraska. That's a great win for Nebraska. It was an overtime game. It was back and forth. Eventually, maybe that doesn't matter as much. So it's interesting, but let's get into some of these games that we
Well, and
had this week. Yeah, go ahead.
and before you do, Austin, it jogged my memory that I forgot to even touch on Iowa because I didn't put them in my top 9. I
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to say it was obviously a phenomenal win. I mean, we talked about it. It's probably the best you could find in the Big Ten, them beating USC.
Yep.
Still at the time, the reason I kept them out, still right at 500 in league play.
Yep.
I still want to see a little bit more. I think there was some serious magic and aura to Caitlin Clark being in the building, the environment, the momentum, the energy, everything about it, which is all great, and they deserve the credit for the win. Still want to see them get above 500 for me to catapult them into that front half, but I think that's coming. I think it's due time. I was going to get right back in the top 9 for me, but that's why I left them out for the time being.
Yeah, and they have 6 losses in the Big Ten, but they're not bad losses.
No,
Like I think the
agreed.
worst net loss they have is Indiana at
Yeah.
39, which on your home floor, that's one you want to win, but
Yep.
it's not one that is like they didn't lose to. I don't want to single teams out in the Big Ten, but they didn't lose to
I know
Northwestern.
what you mean.
You
I know
know,
what you
yeah,
mean. Well,
yeah,
and, and,
exactly.
and that's also the thing, though, Austin. I mean, when we're talking about 13 NCAA tournaments, more than likely out of this Big Ten conference, there's NCAA tournament teams. There's 4 of them. We're
Hmm.
probably going to be leaving off these power polls each week,
Yeah.
and that just is kind of the nature of the league this year, and probably just moving forward in general with the realignment. But so it's not necessarily a shame on Iowa. I mean, it's an NCAA tournament resume. But when you're talking about 13 teams from this conference getting in, and you're trying to stack them up 1 through 9, it's just difficult, and you get into a lot of this hair splitting.
Yeah, and I think from 4 through 13, you can poke holes in
Yeah,
everybody's resume. You
for
can
sure.
you can create an argument for whatever you want based on a team because they all beat each other continually. Michigan beats somebody and then loses to, maybe like beats Oregon but loses to Wisconsin, and Oregon beats Indiana but loses to Michigan. There's all sorts of stuff. Let's talk about the team of the week, which I think was the Iowa Hawkeyes, and just a wonderful game for women's basketball. The atmosphere at Carver Hawkeye was second to none. I'm a big fan of Jason Benetti. So when you put Jason Benetti on
Agreed.
a game, it feels like a really big deal. Fox made this a big deal, and they made it a big deal, not in the sense of like where I think some of us got a little bit worn out with the let's keep Caitlin Clark's score bug on the screen all the time. Let's give it wasn't that. It was just a big deal because it was a big deal for women's basketball. It's arguably the greatest player of all time, getting her jersey retired against one of the players that she's tried to hand the torch off to in Juju Watkins. So to me, I thought Fox did a great job magnifying the event, making sure that it was a big deal, putting Jason Benetti on the call and bringing Caitlin Clark in the booth and talking to her about it, but not losing the flow of the game. And so I thought they did a really good job of that. And you mentioned it. There was an aura in that building, almost like Lucy Olson was like, so I was brought in to be this. And so I'm going to put on a show and make sure everybody knows that is what I'm capable of. And
it was like Space Jam, like Michael Jordan secret stuff. Like Lucy Olson got to drink some of Caitlin Clark's, like the old bottles hanging around there in Carver Hawkeye for the day.
Yep. I mean, she was incredible. 28 points in this one. Down the stretch, Addison O'Grady was nails. Just that left elbow jumper was lethal. She hit the 2 or 3 of those down the stretch. And we could talk about the USC side of this thing in a moment, but just Dalton, the Iowa side, was incredibly impressive. And like we said yesterday on the Bracketology pod, it's a win that nobody has in the Big Ten. We were talking about it last week that we've been surprised that UCLA and USC have been so untouchable in the Big Ten from this middle class. And for the first time this season, somebody from the Peloton reached up and took somebody down from above, not counting the Penn State Ohio State, because I think you're reaching even below the Peloton for that one. But somebody in this like bubble tier of the NCAA tournament finally took down one of the big dogs in Iowa beating USC.
It was incredible. And of course it starts off with 18-1.
20-1.
Iowa.
Yeah.
20-1.
Yeah.
Iowa set the tone out the gate and were able to keep this going in a really incredible win. And the thing that really stood out to me, Austin, besides the environment, the celebration, everything that there was, I felt relief for Jan Jensen and this Iowa team for the moment, because I mean, look, obviously Iowa had this program in the last 2 years in a pretty unreachable standard, right? I mean, it was just remarkable what they did. They went to back-to-back Final Fours, international championship games, and obviously, if you're going to be the person to follow the winningest coach in Lisa Bluter and Caitlin Clark is stepping away, it's not going to be the same. And I think fans are going to be jostled by coming back to reality for a moment, coming back to earth for a moment. And you see the comments after every final score graphic that gets put out by the Iowa team when they were going through the losing stretch they had. And you could feel some of that pressure. I can only imagine what you felt if you were with the Iowa program that maybe they were having. And for them to have a day like this and get a win like this, I felt so good for Jan Jensen and this team that's been kind of put in this weird, impossible situation that I'm laying out there, to have a moment and pick up not just a big win to relieve, but that's a signature crowning win. As you said, nobody else in the Big Ten can boast that.
Yeah, and like Charlie said, nobody else on the bubble can boast that type of win, and now Iowa has it. And just 20-1, and then to lose that lead by halftime, you would think, oh, well, USC is going to do its thing. They just stormed. I mean, you think about how many teams lose a lead like that. Most of them are not getting it back.
Right.
And that's a deflating – I would imagine that was a bit of a deflated locker room. Despite, I think it was, a 1 or 3 point game at halftime. Yeah. Before the game, you would sign up for that as an Iowa fan. But when you're leading 20-1, I don't know how you keep USC to 1 point. That was
insane.
Unbelievable. But to let USC back in the game and still be able to show another gear and put them to bed was impressive. What did this show you, if anything, about a recipe to beat the Trojans for teams coming down the road? Ohio State's going to get a crack at them coming up. Obviously, they've got to play UCLA twice. Anything here that stood out to you on, well, they did this well against USC?
I don't know if I necessarily have an observation like that. I'd be curious if you do. I think the bigger thing was it confirmed this idea that I had that wasn't really carried on much weight, that USC is superiorly talented than many teams in this league, and that's pretty evident. But if they have an off day or night, there are holes to attack. Where UCLA, on the other hand, is so well-rounded, you can't even find the holes in them.
Yep.
Again, USC has so much talent. It's not saying that they're not deserving of a 1 seed eventually, that they're going to be at the top of this Big Ten conference. They're going to have a chance to knock off their rival UCLA for even the Big Ten title. All that's still in front of USC. That's a great ball club. But it felt like they're, with the way they play, if you can catch them on an off night, maybe there's an opportunity. Where UCLA, it just doesn't even feel like that's even a possibility at this point because of how much of a machine they're moving through and just mowing everybody down.
No, we haven't seen the Bruins have an off night. We have
Right.
seen USC have close games this season at
Yes.
Maryland, at Indiana. They've had, I mean, even Minnesota gave them a pretty good run right before this Iowa game. And so I'm not going to sit here and say, oh my gosh, Iowa figured it out. This is what everyone's going to do. To me, it was just two of the big bugaboos for USC this season coming to the surface, which are turnovers. They had 18 of them. That has been an issue at times. It was an issue against Notre Dame. It's been an issue for USC. And they couldn't hit three-point shots. 29% from the three-point line. Juju Watkins was 1 of 7. That type of stuff, when they have struggled this year, that's been the issue, those two things primarily, and they both bucked their head. But again, shooting is so cyclical. I mean, it's just, you can go into a bad cycle and then boom, all of a sudden you start hitting shots and you're back in that groove. So I'm not going to sit here and raise the alarm bells. They went on the road in a tough place to play and shot 29% from 3. It's going to happen. But this is the same team that went to UConn and won. It's the same team that went to Maryland and won, went to Indiana and won. So I'm not going to sit here and be like, this is a disaster for them. And it sounds like Charlie Cream was doing the same thing, keeping them on the one line. But it's more so for me about what it does for Iowa than what it does for USC. But also when you think about what it might do for the Big Ten standings, because now they've got a loss. And even if they split with UCLA, they may not come out with a share of the Big Ten title if nobody else can take a crack at UCLA. So it might mean that now USC's got to find a way to sweep the Bruins, which sounds impossible saying it out loud.
It does.
But good on Iowa. Like you said, there was just like a sense of relief. You could almost see it in Lisa Bluter on the sideline.
Yeah.
Like there was so much relief there from her. I think for her longtime friend, Jan Jansen, who gets a marquee program building type of win there for Iowa. Game of the week, though, as good as that game was, and it was on national TV, and it was well profiled, hidden on Big Ten Plus was a really intriguing game that Illinois beat Maryland 66-65. I want to get into some of the late game, and I know you were working, so you were not watching this, but I got home just in time. I was listening to Mike Kuhn on the way home. Got home just in time to watch the final 5 minutes or so. And this was back and forth the whole fourth quarter. And then Maryland has the ball. Well, first, Illinois is down 2, and Bryn Shoup-Hill just buries a three-pointer with about 45 seconds to go.
You're right. I was working. I didn't catch that. That is still just now hearing that.
Yeah.
That's the first time I saw or hear what happened there at the end. That's incredible.
And this is not a shot on Bryn Shoup-Hill, but you're down 2 under a minute to go. You're probably looking to Genesis Bryant to create something, or you're getting the ball inside to Kendall Bostic. You're not thinking 3, let alone Bryn Shoup-Hill three-pointer, but she
doesn't
buries
fire many
it.
of them.
Yeah. No, so she hits that one. They take the lead. Maryland goes down out of a timeout, down 1, and draws up a 3 for Sarah Tabiasu, which she's not a bad 3-point shooter, but as a team, that's not Maryland's strength. You
Right.
think about when you think of Maryland, Dalton, what comes to mind? You've seen them play. What is their strength
Dribble drive.
offensively?
It is
Yes.
dribble drive all the time.
It's in honor of this podcast. They like to dribble drive. And they have elite players at it. Maybe Cheyenne Sellers isn't 100%. That's probably fair. But you still have Kayleen Schmeichel. And Sarah Tabiasu's pretty good at dribble drives as well. And you've got people like Poffenbarger and Dulcie who can rebound well in case it doesn't go in. So to me, for them to settle for a three-pointer felt very strange in that situation. Now they then get the stop. They come back down, and Cheyenne Sellers hits a floater in the lane, and now they've got the lead. Well, what does Illinois do? They do what they do best, and they get the ball in Genesis Bryant's hand. She goes down, gets fouled, hits 2 free throws. I think she might be one of the top, maybe the top free throw shooter in the Big Ten. She gets there a ton.
Mm-hmm.
And then final play was really good. First one was Cheyenne taking a bit of a contested shot, goes out of bounds off of Illinois, about a second and a half, 2 seconds left. And they draw up a beautiful play where they inbound the ball. Cheyenne's the inbounder. And then they underhand flip it right back to Cheyenne for a baseline jumper. It was a really good look. It didn't go. But I was more like head scratching down one to take a kind of force 3 with a ton of time still left in the game. Felt very strange to me. Maryland as a whole, these two teams kind of feel similar in the fact that they're both dealing with injuries of significant pieces. I think Makaira Cook is more significant than Bree McDaniel in terms of what she means
Agreed.
to her team.
Agreed.
But Illinois has figured it out. Now, my question to you, Dalton, is how sustainable is this solution that Illinois has found, which is to play Genesis Bryant every minute of every game? She played 95 minutes this week in their 2 games. Didn't sit at all. Kendall Bostic's out here playing 95 minutes. Is that sustainable? They played 6 people the entire week. I think Corey Allen logged 1 minute in the Maryland game. I love what Shauna Green is doing, and she's bringing the best out of the roster. Barry Wallace has come along really nicely here in Big Ten play. But how sustainable is it to, A, not have a backup big? So if Kendall Bostic gets in any sort of foul trouble, you're either going 5 guards or she's having to play through it. And B, can this last through March of Genesis Bryant and Kendall Bostic playing every single minute and Adalia McKenzie having to play the majority of minutes? I just don't know how sustainable it is. I don't want to rain on the Illinois parade. It's just my concern for Illinois right now is how sustainable is this?
Well, and I think it's a fair concern. And I think some of it depends on their matchups, right? Like we saw when they played against Michigan State. Michigan State went there. Theron Halleck scored 17 points in the 4th quarter just because she outran everybody down the floor, and everybody was tired on that Illinois team. Not everybody has been able to crack that the same way. I mean, it is evident that we've got about 3 weeks now of Illinois data that says that they can survive this without Cook and Dolan throughout a period. But it is a fair question. We got a month to go in this regular season. Can they survive the month? I think Bostic, when you bring up the point of her down in the post, she's a very cerebral player. I think she does so much of her work early. It keeps her out of foul situations, which is very beneficial, especially when we're talking about her and Brian. It's just there are no subs. You stay out there for the most part. I don't know how to answer the question because I think the answer will reveal itself in the next week or two. If they can survive the next week or two, and you're talking about maybe 2 weeks left to go in the regular season, even if they start running out of gas then, you're all right. Like you should give yourself enough pad where you're in the tournament no matter what. You just avoid a dramatic losing streak at the end. But it is a very fair question. And like I said, Michigan State was one of those teams that were able to just wear them down. So far, other teams haven't maybe pushed the tempo the same way, but I'm curious if some teams have that capability or have that second gear, if they don't try it just to wear them down.
When they came to Bloomington, they were off a week's rest, and they looked it. They were physical. They were fresh. They played Indiana very hard and dominated that game. You mentioned, can they keep it going and survive? Well, here's their next 4 games. 3 of them at home: Northwestern, at Wisconsin, Penn State, Nebraska. That is a really workable upcoming stretch for Illinois. Now, then they have the LA swing, which in and of itself is going to be hard for literally anybody in this conference. We're going to see how maybe the best other fares this week with Ohio State.
Yep.
But then you finish with Michigan at home. That's got to be one of the more favorable Big Ten schedules remaining for
Agreed.
one of these teams in the middle of the pack. I wouldn't rule Illinois out.
Yeah.
And just to throw this up on the screen, the Big Ten standings, I would not rule them out of that fight for the 4 seed right now. They're hot. They've won 4 in a row. They've got a chance of winning 4 more in a row. With I would imagine they would be, whether there's an actual line or not, they would be the favorites in the next 4 games on their schedule. And can you imagine if we're talking about an 11-4 Illinois team, and let's just say they do lose the LA games, they could finish 12-6. They're certainly an NCAA tournament team. Now, the question is, when you do have this type of wear and tear on bodies playing 40 minutes, does that creep up on you in a game you're not expecting it to? When you go to Wisconsin, I mean, we saw it happen with Michigan. Can you go there, have some tired legs, and not have a good shooting night, and all of a sudden, I mean, we know there's a gap between 13 and 14 in the league, but that doesn't mean those teams can't get you. I mean, Rutgers almost did. Rutgers had them on the ropes, ball in Kaomi McMiller's hand with 5 seconds to go, and she commits a charge, and that sends the game to overtime. They had Illinois on the ropes, so I'm not going to sit here and say they are going to win 4 straight. It is a nice, favorable stretch for a team that is working its way through some injury issues, and I don't know if we're going to get the answer on the tired legs until we may get to the end of the season and look back at maybe a tough loss in the NCAA tournament and go, yeah, they look tired.
Exactly. I was going to say, well, and that's the other question is, because now that you bring up that schedule, which I'm glad you did, that kind of helps reframe maybe the rest of the way for Illinois. But maybe it begs the question of what is the postseason ceiling for a team that is going to be severely fatigued by season's end. Every team's going to be tired, but it will kind of beg that question. But I mean, you talk about those matchups and that Illinois will be favored. I mean, just to throw out the outlier again, Penn State beat Ohio State earlier this year. Like it's impossible for anything to happen in these games. But something like, we're talking about the matchups and teams that like to push. Northwestern does not necessarily like to push transition. They're not a high tempo team. Neither is Wisconsin. They like to play around Sarah Williams in the half court. Penn State likes to throw Gracie Merkel in the post and play around that. They're not built for up tempo. Nebraska with Markowski, they don't necessarily play up tempo. So when we're talking about the tempo of those upcoming games, those next 4 are kind of play into the front court type games, which I think really benefits the Illini pretty well.
Yeah, and I want to give a shout out. We mentioned she played 95 minutes this week. My player of the week was Genesis Bryant. I believe she was co-player of the week with Lucy Olson from the Big Ten. I have some Hoosier fans that have given me some text messages like, how did Yarden not win? Ours doesn't include Washington. Our show is every Tuesday, so I go Tuesday to Tuesday. I think it's fair to consider the Big Tens being Monday to Monday. That Garzone hit 13 threes this past week and didn't get a co-share of that one. Fair. But no, I mean, you play 95 minutes, you put up 48 combined points. She was terrific. Just absolutely.
And she drew the charge on McMiller at the end of that game in regulation. So doing it both ways, leading the team, I'm with you. I think it's good, but still give Yarden the shout out, because even though it might be a day or so off or whatever, it was fair. That was an impressive week for her.
It was. Then one thing with Illinois, then we'll move on. Big Ten tournament, I would watch who's playing Illinois. Because if you're playing 6 players, it's going to be hard to make a run 4 games in 4 days. So if you've got Illinois on the second day of a back-to-back, I like that team. It also puts more importance on, can Illinois finish strong and get that 4 seed and get the double bye? I'm curious what the record's going to be of the 4 seed. Because right now it's Michigan State at 8-3, right? 8-3?
Yep.
7? Yeah, 8-3. Yep. So is it going to be 5 losses? Because everybody else has at least 4.
Yep.
Michigan State still has to play Ohio State, USC, and UCLA.
All on the road, by the
All
way,
on the
because
road.
Michigan State somehow ended up with those 3 on the road, Nebraska on the road, Illinois on the road. Everybody's on the road this year for Michigan
Incredible.
State.
Incredible. Let's talk. Gosh, whose roller coaster week do we want to talk about next? I mean, this was just. Also, congratulations to Illinois. That was their first ever win over Maryland. So
Yeah.
definitely worth shouting out. Let's talk Michigan. I don't know what just happened.
Well, I was going to say you could use that sentence with Oregon or Michigan or a couple of teams, but yeah, I don't really know how to start with Michigan either. You
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
need like the for the Oregon game, you need the Brooklyn Nine-Nine Jake Peralta clip where he says, "Guess who just got murdered?" And that's what happened in the Michigan Oregon game. But let's first off, freshman of the week was Olivia Olson, put up 30 in the loss to Wisconsin, put up another good showing in the blowout win over Oregon, but this was a score that I did not watch the game, and I'm just kind of hanging out. I think it was Wednesday night, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at my scores, and I'm saying, "What?"
Yeah.
Like, and we talked about it on Tuesday last week that this is a team that's led by 3 freshmen, and they're going to have moments where they look really good, and they're going to have moments where they don't look great. I didn't think it would go to this, but again, it goes to that. Yes, there's a gap between 13 and 14, but they can all steal a game at any moment. And Wisconsin was ready to go in this one. Sarah Williams was absolutely tremendous this week. She put up 22 in this one, then 28 in their loss at Purdue. But when you're getting a 53% field goal shooting night and 48% from 3 for Wisconsin, that's when they become tough to beat, because if you can put shooters around Sarah Williams and you can't double her anymore, and when Tess Myers and Lily Cron are able to knock these shots down, it just becomes a whole different ball game. Cron was 4 of 6 from 3. Leitzinger was 3 of 4. Myers was 4 of 8. This game was tied 70-70 with 2 minutes left. Carter McRae hit a bucket, and they went on a 10-3 run to finish the game. So, just a head scratcher for Michigan. Which was the more head scratching result, though, Dalton? This one or this one? Michigan 40, Oregon, or Michigan 80, Oregon 48.
To me,
This
it's
was going
that
on
one.
concurrently with my game. So I got home, I looked at the score, and again, it was a double check.
Yeah, and I didn't get to watch this one in real time either. I just did the box score watching while I was broadcasting our game and just saw this flash across and said, "Whoa, whoa!" And to me, this one's more head scratching because Wisconsin. I mean, you talk about they shot it really well, and factor in the emotion piece of this too, right? It was a week ago that Michigan State and Michigan. Was it a week ago? Am I getting confused on dates? It was about a week and a half ago now at
Yeah,
this point
yeah.
that they played, and so this was pretty fresh off of uh, having your rival uh, up on them on the scoreboard, 33-29 it was at halftime, and then losing by 30 on your home court in that rivalry game, in that Michigan State Michigan game. And by the way, off of that Michigan State game for the Spartans was when they hosted Oregon. And so there's a part of the human side of you, I think, that wonders the emotion of it, of does Michigan finish that game where they lose by 30 and say, what just happened? Does that kind of carry over a little bit? Is Michigan State on such a high that like you kind of have to recalibrate after that game? This one, though, is most confusing to me from not even just the emotion side that I throw out there, Austin, but the matchup side. I before that game said, who is going to be able to handle Philly Che in the post? Now, Philly Che, by the way, if you haven't watched a lot of Oregon basketball, she's 6'8". She is a rebounding machine. She has great soft touch around the rim. However, she only scores about 7 points per game. So she averages like 7 points and 8 rebounds, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But her size alone is a factor, even if it isn't resulting in points and rebounds. It's something that honestly kept Michigan State stupefied for a while in its game, where Michigan State could not figure out how to beat the size of Che in the post. And heading into that one, Michigan does not have a deep front court. I mean, they for a lot of times will play 5 guards.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went into that thinking, how is that going to work? They have Michigan has extremely fundamental, extremely solid basketball players that all can shoot, but they don't necessarily have over athleticism that you would say like a Maryland has, where they're going to dribble drive you to death and be able to create their own lanes. Michigan doesn't necessarily have that. They find other ways to create shots. And heading into that one, I just didn't see how it would happen, and let alone they win not just the game, but win by 32. That one, I just still cannot wrap my head around.
There's always the two-sided coin to that. Where you're like,
Yeah.
how are they going to defend Philly Che? But how is Philly Che going to defend these guards?
Yeah.
Because she now has to come out and defend them. And Philly Che did have 11 and 8 in this game. But one of the things I noticed, and you probably noticed this too, when you prep for Oregon, you look at the box scores and you're like, and I've noticed this just as I've collected box scores throughout the year for this podcast. You're like, okay, so the leading scorer had 11, and then another person had 11, and then another had 9, and then 2 more had 8, and there's a couple with 7. And like, they're never, when I go through my whole sheet trying to pick my player of the week and I throw my honor rolls in there's not many times an Oregon Duck pops into that list because they're usually scoring, lead scorer between 11 and 14 points. And then there's a bunch of people that follow suit between 9 and 6 points. And death by 1,000 cuts, it gets you when they can control the tempo and make it a race to 60. Yep. Oregon is a favorite to win the game. But if you are like Michigan, who got out, ran, hit 3-point shots, really stretched Oregon, and all of a sudden you make it an offensive game, Oregon can struggle in that. Michigan State and Indiana, back-to-back games, the dribble drive got swept by Oregon. And both of our teams fell into that kind of low-scoring battle. Now, Michigan State got hot in the second half and almost completed the comeback, but it was almost too little too late. What'd you have, 22 points at halftime?
That sounds about right. I know it was 21-8 Oregon at first quarter end.
And Indiana had 25 at halftime and scored 22 in the second half. So, like, if Oregon keeps the game slow and they can keep themselves in it, their defense is so good that it can fight. Now, this will be the first one, I believe, in 12 games that somebody scored over their points per game average against the Oregon defense, because I know Michigan State didn't do it, the Hoosiers didn't do it, and I think it was 10 straight going into the Indiana game.
I was going to say, I think it hit 12 after MSU, and I think it was not just for the points per game average, but I think those 12 teams didn't hit 70, if I remember the stat right.
It was.
That's how good the defense has been for the Ducks.
Yep, and Michigan put on a show. Now, Oregon shot 29% from the floor, made just 5 3-pointers.
They used it all in East Lansing. I could tell you that much. That's
Michigan shot 54% from the floor. They got a double-double from Olivia Olson. Mila Holloway was great. 45% from 3. Just, I mean, it is clinical. So this is one of those head-scratching for both teams, because let's flash the other Oregon result on the screen. Oregon 63, Michigan State 59. So Michigan loses to Wisconsin. Oregon beats Michigan State. So you're going into Ann Arbor going, okay, Oregon's bringing in the momentum. And like Charlie Cream said yesterday, maybe Michigan's running out of steam a little bit with all these freshmen. And you just would never. If you told me that somebody was going to win that game by 30, I would have said, okay, it's probably going to be Oregon. Mm-hmm. And it was no. So Oregon, but I don't want, and I guess my power rankings showed this, I don't want to like totally focus on the Michigan game for Oregon, because this Michigan State win was really impressive. And the way they dominated this game, like you said, it was one of their best shooting nights of the season. And I do think there's something too, and we've talked about this on the podcast, the back end of those long road trips where you've been on the road for 5 or 6 days, you haven't been in your own bed, you've been practicing in random gyms, you're eating hotel food, and everything's just kind of out of whack. And we saw it with Nebraska and Indiana. We saw it with, honestly, with some of these teams going out to LA. We saw it here with Oregon coming across the country and really struggling in this last game against Michigan. There's something to be said about that. But at the start of the trip, Oregon was gangbusters. And unfortunately, you had a front row seat to the whole thing.
Yeah, and, you know, it's an impressive win for Oregon that kind of came in the streak of a win over Iowa at the time, a
Mhm.
win against Indiana at the time, and then this one. And you're starting to really believe in the Ducks. And what's really interesting, and I'm with you, Austin, and I don't mean this as a pejorative. I don't mean this as an insult to Oregon at all. I think they are a good team. They are not the most talented team in
Yeah.
the Big Ten. And I also think they understand that. I think they've embraced that as part of their identity, where they say, you know what, let's kind of flash it back to Dick Bennett 2000 Wisconsin basketball style. And you know what? We don't even need the ball on offense. You guys can just keep it. We just want to
Yeah.
guard you.
They're
We
just
just want
going
to
to out tough you.
yeah, yeah, and that's their identity right now. They're going to out tough people, and they did it in their contest up in East Lansing. They did it against Indiana. They did it against Iowa. There has been a recipe for this, and I still think there's wins in front of them, grinding out games. But that is how Oregon will win games. They will be grind out, trap your opponent in quicksand type wins, and it works for them. I mean, they've been able to reel this off. Now, how high is that ceiling? Does that mean they could beat one of the LA schools? Do they still have the LAs, or have they already played the LA?
They will get UCLA coming up at home this week.
Right. And see,
Yeah.
like UCLA to me, it's too much talent,
Yeah.
honestly, for just about anybody.
They do get Maryland this week at home, which is a really interesting one, which we'll
That
talk
one's going to be really
about.
interesting with Maryland being out of sorts. I know we'll still get
Yes.
to the upcoming schedule, but I think I'm with you. I think Oregon deserves so much credit for executing the game plan in their style the way they have. I think there might be a certain ceiling on it,
Yes. Yeah.
but they have executed it really well, and they deserve a ton of praise for that.
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's a talent ceiling,
Yeah.
but they have kind of crushed that ceiling of what we thought preseason. And
Yes.
give Kelly Graves a ton of credit because probably the most roster turnover of anybody in the country. I mean, Philly Che's one of the few that he's been able to build around. Even Peyton Scott, who was with the program last year, was injured and didn't play.
Yep.
So he has made the most out of this thing and has put it together. And they're certainly a tournament team. I don't think there's any doubt about that for Oregon right now. A couple other scores we should breeze through. The Buckeyes beat Washington 66-56. There wasn't a whole lot in this one. Ohio State was down early, did their thing. They pressed Washington. They forced a lot of turnovers. You know, the Ohio State deal. The bigger story for Ohio State is what's coming up, which we'll get into in a moment. UCLA does their thing. They dominated. I mean, this was a 5-point game at halftime, and they ran away with it with Betts scoring 4 points. 4 points, Dalton, and they won by 26. Now, she had a career-high 11 assists, which, again, is the Zach Edey thing, where when you're going to have all that attention on you, you've got to be really good at passing the basketball. And it's something that here in Indiana, we saw the maturation of Mackenzie Holmes get better at that. On the men's side, we saw the maturation of Trace Jackson Davis become an incredible facilitator because you have to. You're going to get mobbed with bodies. And Lauren Betts was awesome in this game, getting the ball out, and then credit her shooters. They knock down shots and get this dominant win. Again, not much to touch on there for UCLA. Indiana wins against Nebraska 76-60. Just a really detail-oriented performance by the Hoosiers. Just seemed ready to go. Scouting report, energy, everything was perfectly in place. Nebraska never got it within 9 after the first quarter. And the observation I have here is on the Nebraska side of things. Alexis Markowski played just 18 minutes, barely played in the second half. Now, Indiana was, and I think this is where Indiana can use its 5 position to their benefit, where Caroline Strickland and Lily Meister are not the biggest posts in the conference, but they run the floor extremely well. And they were doing that in this game, and that was wearing out Markowski, and it was giving Indiana easy buckets. So you can turn that matchup on its head if you can get stops and get out and run. Indiana was able to do that. But like you said during the power ranking segment, if Markowski is not giving you a dominant performance, this team looks a little bit lost offensively. You need Callan Hake to give you something. You need Logan Nisley to give you something. And they are hit and miss. and you'll get a 14-point performance from Callan Hake, and then you'll get 3. And it's just, I think that the Natalie Potts injury has proven to be even bigger than we could have possibly imagined when it happened. And I think Amy Williams and her staff are still, to this day, trying to figure out where they can go. Where are the dependable parts of this offense when Markowski is taken out of the game? And you think about their losses this season. In LA, those are tough losses, but Markowski was completely blanketed in those games. Indiana, she did not have much happening in that game. I don't remember what she did against Ohio State, but overall, they kind of go as Markowski and Prince go, and Prince was quiet at 11 points. And again, I stand here on my soapbox and say Chloe Moore-McNeil is one of the best defenders in the Big Ten. She took Britt Prince out of the game, but they just didn't have it offensively, and Indiana took advantage of that.
Well, and I was going to say, when you talk about Callan Hake, you talk about Logan Nisley, besides just maybe the streakiness of the Husker shooters, if they're going to hit or not, so much of their even shot attempts is predicated on a 2-touch on Markowski, on a double in the post and a kick out. Like, besides Britt Prince and Markowski being double teamed, there aren't many other shot creating options in that Husker offense. And I think that's kind of the trap they find themselves in right now.
The other concern for Nebraska is that opponents are averaging over 72 points a game on them in the Big Ten. So their defense is really struggling right now. Their scoring margin it was 1 point something before that Indiana game, so it might even be negative now, despite a 7-4 record, because when they have lost, they've lost pretty big. And so just something to monitor. The defense does not seem to be there right now for Nebraska. But again, I'll give some credit to the Hoosiers. This was a really nice performance. Chloe Moore-McNeil when she is on, this team is so good. And she had 15 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, 4 steals, took on the assignment of Britt Prince. And that's when this team is at their best. Garzone was great. I think the change of Striplin in the starting lineup has made a lot of difference here. And it's been for both. Lily Meister looks more comfortable coming off the bench, and Caroline Striplin has just been really good. 4 straight games she has started, 4 straight games in double figures. And then Sydney Parrish is doing what she does. She's just a great role player that is going to knock down shots. And she's been in double figures now in 7 straight, I believe 8 of 9 or 9 of 10 since the injury. So she's just a dependable option for you. If Indiana, like Terry Morin told me before the game, yes, the Garzone performance against Washington was great, and Sid had a good game as well, but they need more than 2 people. And they got that. They got 4 in double figures against Nebraska. That's how this team wins, and by having great defense, which it was terrific in that game. Big stretch for Indiana coming up here, as many Big Ten teams do, but they've got Rutgers at home, and then at Minnesota, at Michigan. Back-to-back road games against teams you're fighting for position in the Big Ten Conference. You win both of those, and it totally turns this season around. You're definitely in the upper 6 or 7 in the Big Ten, and you can position yourselves to maybe fight for a top 4 seed. So big week coming up. Last score to shout out, Boilermakers are on the board.
Hey, how about
84-71. Cheers to our guy, Tim Newton. Excited for him. That's a really good win there for Purdue, because Wisconsin was coming off that win over Michigan. And Sarah Williams had 28 in this game. And another one where you're like, okay, how is Purdue going to handle Sarah Williams?
Yeah.
And their guards just said, we're just going to score. And they had a really nice shooting day. So good on Purdue. They are on the board. And right now, as we pull up the Big Ten standings again for you, they are in the midst of that fight to make it to Indianapolis right now. I believe, again, that I have these tiebreaker oriented, that right now in that 5-8 log jam, I really had to go through some tiebreaker stuff, but I believe that that's correct. Illinois would be the top out of that group. But again, you look at Michigan State through Indiana, all separated by 1 loss in the loss column. And Indiana still plays Maryland. It still plays Michigan State. It still plays Ohio State. And right behind them, they still play Michigan and Minnesota. So the Hoosiers have an opportunity to separate themselves. Michigan State has a huge opportunity to just close the door by playing all these teams at the top of the conference. So Fascinating week. There's also the wrinkle as we transition now into the week ahead. There's the wrinkle that if Ohio State falls twice this week, Dalton, they fall to 9-3. And that means that everybody from the 3 seed down have at least 3 losses.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they still have to play at Maryland. They still have to play at Indiana. There's still Iowa, I believe, on that schedule for Ohio State as well.
And I'm assuming odds makers,
Michigan
if there's a
State.
line for it, they would favor Ohio State against Michigan State, but that's a big one
Yep.
still to come. That's a big one later on.
Absolutely. So you think if they go to LA and don't get a win, which is completely feasible and not necessarily something you're going to hold against Ohio State, but it does open the door now for the Illinois, the Indianas, the Nebraskas, the Oregons to potentially fight their way into that top 4, because for a while there, it felt like it was 4 and then everybody else.
Yep.
And now Michigan State has opened that door. Illinois is starting to try and open that door. And Maryland has let them in. Now, Ohio State has an opportunity this week to either make sure they're a top 3 team in the Big Ten or potentially get themselves into a bit of a hairy situation. Looking at this schedule, tonight is the awesome one. One of the many that this week. There's a ton of good games. But how about Ohio State at UCLA? Eastern time bias. I hate the 9:30 start, but we'll be a little groggy. We'll handle it. But cannot wait to see how Ohio State plays that one. Then they will be at USC on Saturday night. That's another late night, 9:00 on Fox. That is a primetime hoops game. I would guess maybe Gus Johnson will have that one. He typically does their primetime games that they advertise. I don't know if that's the case, but the huge week for Ohio State. It's one of those weeks where you can propel yourself into the Big Ten title race and make sure you're going to be a top 2 or 3 seed in the NCAA tournament, or you fall out of there with nothing. You open the door in the standings. Now you're I don't think they're going to lose their national hosting position, but the Big Ten standings get a little bit more interesting. Or you split and we just sit here next week and we're like, yeah, okay, they got 1 of 2. Cool.
And you're right. And I don't think they're in danger of losing the national hosting as long as they're competitive. I mean, if we're looking at an 80-48 score that we saw of Oregon at Ann Arbor, if something wonky like that happens, then it changes the conversation around Ohio State a bit. But if they're out there and competitive and lose both, nobody will really blink an eye.
Yep, totally agree with that. So they obviously headline the schedule, but if you want to watch bubble teams play other bubble teams, this is a great week for you.
What a league.
How about Thursday night, tomorrow night? We're going to get Michigan at Nebraska. We're going to get Iowa at Minnesota, and we're going to get Maryland at Oregon. All those teams, Maryland's not on the bubble, but all those teams are in the middle of the Big Ten Conference, separated, I believe, by 2 losses in the Big Ten standings, and all going to be matching up against one another in a 1-hour time slot there. So we're going to need multiple screens Thursday night. I'm so thankful that our game is at 6:00, so I will race home and be able to watch all those games. And then, of course, Saturday night is that Ohio State USC game. You guys get, more aptly, Michigan gets a second crack at Michigan State. This one in the Breslin Center, a little Sunday afternoon action for you there. The Hoosiers will be up in Minnesota. UCLA at Oregon. It's always interesting to me when UCLA goes on the road. I'm just curious, when is that slip up, if any? I'm starting to believe as we go longer in the season, it just isn't going to happen.
There just isn't one.
But, I mean, if you wanted to throw somebody at Lauren Betts, size-wise, Philly Che, she's, I believe, an inch taller than Lauren Betts. So that will be interesting. Maryland continues their West Coast swing. As big of a week as it is for Ohio State out west, could be a bigger week for Maryland, Dalton, because of what they're dealing with. They are now 7-4 in the Big Ten, which is shocking. And they still have some tough games left on their schedule. So a team that was trying to fight for a national hosting and still can, but this is a huge week for them against a couple of teams that on paper they're better than, but they're on the road, long road trip, all the way across the country. Very curious how Maryland responds.
Well, and I also think they're on paper better than Illinois, and they
Well,
they
yeah.
were dropped 66-65, and so you continue that out to Oregon, and obviously, I mean, I agree with you. I think Maryland on paper is better than a lot of teams. I think they're better than Oregon, but Oregon wants to trap you and put you in the mud. And if
Yep.
you're coming off a game where you only scored 65 against the Illini, Oregon's going to try and hold that down to about 50, and that's just the way the Ducks want to play. And Washington. Look, we didn't talk much about the Huskies, but they were close in that Ohio
Mm-hmm.
State game. Like that was a close competitive game down the stretch. In a game that Ledeen and Sellers were combined, 3 for 15 or 3 for 20?
Yep.
I mean, the Huskies had a chance there. So if the Huskies have a good day, Maryland could be in trouble on that West Coast swing.
No doubt. I mean, looking at Maryland's schedule, they did put up 82 at Penn State, but the 65 against Illinois, and then the 3 games before Penn State, 67, 66, 51. And that was in their 3-game losing streak. Now, 3 top 10 teams,
Right.
but the offense does seem to have taken a bit of a step back here since the 99-point explosion they had against Minnesota. So curious to see if they can find some offense. I've said Eugene is where offenses go to die. So not a great place to be trying to find your offense again. I will say, and again, unfortunate spot for Washington, they tend to be where people come after getting beaten and bruised in Eugene. Yep. And then you go to Washington, and several teams have had that bounce back performance. You think about Iowa going there and losing 50-49 to Oregon, and then just exploding on
shooting
Washington.
80% from the floor, it felt like.
Yarden hits 0 threes at Oregon, then hits 8 at Washington.
That's a good point.
It's such a contrast of styles, those two teams are, that after getting beaten up by Oregon, you're almost like, oh, this team isn't in my grill defensively. Okay, I can actually get into my offense a little bit here. Washington obviously has other ways they beat you. That high pick and roll with Delia Daniels is becoming more and more deadly. But big week for Maryland out west. And then Monday night, we'll get the Nebraska-Iowa rematch, which was an instant classic the first time. This one will be in Lincoln. And it's funny, the first time they played, Dalton, it was kind of a prove-it opportunity for Nebraska where we're like, okay, Nebraska's got this thing figured out. And it was, what is going on with Iowa? Mm-hmm. And now going into Lincoln, it's, okay, Iowa's got this thing rolling and Nebraska's reeling. So it is fascinating to see how quickly that one shifted. Iowa will have Minnesota on the road before that. So if they win that one, they're going to be coming off of a couple of big wins, whereas Nebraska's looking at themselves trying to kind of lick their wounds here right now. Nebraska will get Michigan at home and then Iowa on that Monday. So fascinating week. You and I keep texting about how unpredictable this conference is. And again, just one final time, throw up the standings here. It's just wild. I mean, you just look at 4 through 12 and it's like, oh my goodness. No, Iowa is probably not contending for a top 4 seed. Right. But, I mean, probably more aptly looking at 5 through 13, all within 2 games of each other in the loss column. It is going to be a sprint to the finish. And, oh, yeah, a lot of 5 through 13 play each other in the final month of the season. So if you think you're going to get clarity, you may just get more cloudiness because all these teams are just going to take turns beating each other and nobody's going to separate. But it is an opportunity, Dalton, if one of these teams can go on a run and can separate, that 4 seed is wide open.
Oh, I agree. Well, and this is the thing, too, we told everybody, Austin, before the season started. Whether your interest is at the top of the league in the LAs and Ohio State, and you want to see how that plays out, they're all going to be playing each other over the next few weeks. If you're a fan of one of the 10 teams that's bunched up in the middle of this Big Ten conference, they're all going to be beating each other up, and it's going to be fun to watch the drama and reality TV show it is for the next month. And even if you're a fan at the bottom of the conference, those final 5 spots are up for grabs. and to see who it makes the Big Ten tournament. Because again, a reminder, the last 3 will not be in the Big Ten tournament. So wherever your interest lies, there is drama, top, middle, bottom of this Big Ten conference. And it's going to be fun, partner, over the February month.
There's nobody who you feel like is locked into their position. Even Northwestern at 0-9, you saw them. I've seen them. They gave Iowa everything they could handle at Carver Hawkeye. They're going to knock somebody off here, and then they're going to jump right into that conversation for that 15 seed. But at the top, we've been wanting to see those top 3 teams play each other. Like you said, we're finally going to get a little taste of that this week with Ohio State getting both of them. And I believe then next week we will get the LA schools' first matchup between each other. And then they'll finish the season, I believe, March 1st playing each other again. That is going to be absolutely must-watch TV. Well, Dalton, this has been wonderful. Our longest episode yet, where just the two of us talk about nonsense. Not nonsense.
Too excited.
But we are excited. We're thrilled. We're also less than 3 weeks away from the Dribble Drive Bowl, so excited to get the Hoosiers and the Spartans on the same floor. What do we got? The 23rd? Yeah,
22nd or 23rd.
Yeah, Sunday the 23rd. We will be up in East Lansing, Hoosiers and Spartans. We will try and put out some fun content either Saturday or Sunday morning, getting a little deep dive preview on the Dribble Drive Bowl. And we're actually exactly a month away from the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis. So that's going to be awesome as well. And if you think the regular season has been confusing, can't wait until that Big Ten tournament, because as we've been saying, anybody can beat anybody. And in a tournament setting on a neutral site, trying to play 4 or 5 games in 5 days, it's going to be absolutely exciting.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, to have all of it compressed into a week in what I think is one of the better places to go watch. Now, again, I'm biased. I grew up in the state of Indiana, but Indianapolis is always a blast to have that tournament, and that's going to be a lot of fun.
Minneapolis did a great job hosting it, but sure. I am thrilled that it's in Indianapolis, and we'll try and put out some fun content there as well. Keep tuned to our YouTube channel. It's the Back Home Network YouTube channel. There's other podcasts there, but we are the Big Ten women's basketball, trying to cover a huge scope of things with 18 teams continuing to play great basketball in this conference. We're also available on Apple and Spotify podcasts. We are live on the YouTube channel every Tuesday next week. For Dalton Shetler, I'm Austin Render. Thanks for joining us. Tell a friend, hit that like and subscribe button. We appreciate you stopping by. We'll talk to you next Tuesday.